Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So we're continuing the unit on the law and you as we're going through some very famous and very important Supreme Court cases and how those court cases interpreted individual liberty, regulated government, basically how the Supreme Court takes the Constitution and interprets it and decides what laws are good and bad and how, if a law oversteps its bounds, the Supreme Court can throw it out. Some of the laws that we're going to start talking about today, and some of the Supreme Court cases, show how the Supreme Court over time interprets the Constitution a little differently. Because as America changes hundreds of years since the Constitution, the interpretation of the Constitution changes. As we have talked about, or I talk about quite a bit in American history, that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, two guys who wrote the Constitution, argued viciously over what it meant immediately after it was written. So the Supreme Court takes it upon themselves to kind of interpret the Constitution differently over time, trying to, invoke the spirit of the rules of the Constitution in modern events. In modern cases. So let's talk about some of those today. You're going to like this. Let's get started. So the first Supreme Court case we're going to talk about today is the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States in 1964. Now, before we jump right into this, let me give you a little backstory of what is happening in America leading up to 1964. As we have talked about with Plessy versus Ferguson and the Brown versus Board of Education, obviously racial tensions and segregation and integration has been an issue for quite a while in the United States. Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education made it illegal to segregate schools. Now, if you hadn't lived through it, which none of y'all did if you're my students, let's be honest, at this point in 2021, you guys weren't alive in 9/11, much less during integration. So we won't fault you for thinking, hey, 1954, can't segregate schools. Glad that's over, and you move on. No. So while schools legally can't segregate based on race, those are government institutions. Segregation was still happening. All right, you would have black-only areas and white-only areas separated by law, especially in parts of the South. There's a massive movement to end this as Americans, the majority, realize, hey, not the best situation. This is going to lead to the Civil Rights Movement. All right. So the Civil Rights Movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr., is the general push that black Americans should be treated equal as white Americans. This right here is his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, right, leading up to this court case that we're going to be talking about in 1964. The "I Have a Dream" speech, and where Martin Luther King says, his dream is that white kids and black kids can, live together and be equal. What's also, I think, is important here is giving you a little backstory here. Look at the crowd. All right, this is his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. These aren't, it's not all African Americans here wanting equality. It's pretty equal. It's white and black. There's a massive part of the population. All right, the majority of the population realizes how wrong this is to basically segregate certain Americans into groups and not others. Not that segregation from any group would be acceptable, but with this huge motivating factor, Martin Luther King Jr., he is able to get the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, to sign a very famous law called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Act of 1964, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s here behind him during this famous picture of him signing the Civil Rights Act, which Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent protest really brought a lot of awareness to the concept that, hey, segregation is not cool and that black people are denied equal rights under the law. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 declares, now, this is a law by Congress, right? It says there is no segregation in public places, no discrimination in employment based on race, gender, or national origin. All right. So, hey, overdone with, right? Well, that brings us to our Supreme Court case, which is the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. So, the Heart of Atlanta Motel, I know this might seem crazy to you, it's in the heart of Atlanta. All right. It is a segregated hotel. Only white people can stay at the Heart of Atlanta Motel. Even when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gets passed, in which they say, hey, you can't segregate anymore, the owner of the Heart of Atlanta Motel, a guy named Morton M. Rolliston, says, yeah, I can still do that. And he refuses to open it up to African Americans and says it remains white only. Here's why he says. He says it's one thing when the federal government comes out with Brown versus Board of Education and rules for themselves. Federal government or the government in general ruling for themselves that they, the government, will not segregate. But he's a private business. As a private citizen in a private business, he can run his hotel or his motel however he wants, and he can pick and choose who he wants to come into his motel. And if he wants it to be white only, the federal government does not have the ability to say what a private owner can do with his private business. That is beyond their scope. Specifically, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 went on to say it has to do with commerce for trade. That is why specifically hotels, because it specifically says hotels and motels in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it says that because of trade, African Americans need to travel for work, they have to have a place to stay. If they go to an all-white area and there's no all-black hotels, it causes an issue. All right, which had happened actually in World War II with a big protest that took place in Washington D.C. But that's a whole another story for another course. So he says that he should not have to be forced to do something with his own private business. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has to decide, at what point does the federal government have the ability to tell a private business what to do? Now, a lot of it's arguing over commerce. It gets technical. So the little niche the Supreme Court is going to be focused on here is trade and commerce as opposed to just the lump concept of, can you deny a group of people based on their race? But regardless, the outcome will be the same. Now, we have talked about this. It is very rare for the Supreme Court to rule unanimously on something. So Brown versus Board of Education was unanimous, and that was mind-blowing. All right, but that was them focusing on a government institution, which is public school. All right, how are they going to react to private businesses? All right, because this guy Morton says all his rights are being violated under the Constitution if he just is told what he can or can't do, that he's basically being forced into doing something. This man actually invokes, which I think is kind of a side story here. One of his arguments on why he shouldn't have to is he invokes the 13th Amendment, saying he is being forced to do something against his will, which the 13th Amendment ended slavery, and that he would be forced to do something against his will, like involuntary servitude, which is outlawed in the 13th Amendment, which seems a little tone deaf to me since he's clearly trying to racially say black people can't stay in a motel, but also the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves, which were like 99%, at the time it was all black. We'll just say that. It would be a small enough percentage otherwise that it would be irrelevant. So anyway, he's not going to win this case. The Supreme Court rules 9-0. That's huge. Huge. For the United States, that you absolutely cannot deny somebody based on sex, race, or that. This is big because even though this is a private business, all Americans, unlike the 14th Amendment, are treated equal. And the reason, all right, that you can't have one American segregating based on another American based on a preconceived notion. Like, it's one thing if you don't want Billy to stay at your hotel because, well, we all know Billy's crazy, man. Billy does this or that, and you know him individually. That's fine. But having prejudice against a group of people, meaning before this person with blonde hair, or in this guy's case, if you're black, before they walk into your store or place of business, you've already decided you will not serve them based on a prejudice in certain protected classes, which was all added in 1964 in the law. And the Supreme Court backs it up. The Supreme Court looks at not only trade. This was kind of the big part of this one where they said you can't deny somebody to stay here because it would hurt trade. But the other court cases that are going to use this as a precedent, like there's like 300 and some within a couple years that all stay with the ruling of Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States, is that you are keeping Americans down by doing it. And the Constitution is trying to make everybody equal. Like you can't aggressively, especially as the majority, keep part of the population down. It's a whole new way of looking at the Constitution, as in, what was the spirit of the rule of the Constitution? Like, what did they, if they were here today, how would they do this? As opposed to, how would they have done it if this issue came up in 1789? All right, so it is the idea that the document is kind of a living document, and the ideals written by the Founding Fathers should be reinterpreted, which is always touchy because the Founding Fathers themselves, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, they didn't actually even agree on the strict or loose constructionist concept of the Constitution. But this kind of shows there's a changing view of the Constitution as a living document, and it's kind of the spirit of the rule of how it was written originally, not necessarily what that rule was in the late 1700s. All right, got another one coming up for you. You're going to like this. So pause me, answer this completely, and moving on. Miranda v. Arizona. Wow. All right. You might remember Miranda. Do I know that? You might. All right. Hopefully just been watching law shows. Here's this dude. I tried to try to look this stuff up pretty objectively. You don't need to like this guy. This guy's Ernesto Miranda. However, let me tell you a story of Ernesto Miranda, of what happens here. This guy gets arrested for the kidnapping and rape of an 18-year-old woman. And you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, you can dislike this guy. It's fine. It's a whole thing. All right. So Ernesto gets arrested. All right. And there is like 1,000 different pieces of evidence that basically show that he did this. They can prove it, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it's clear that he had done this. So the police arrest him. All right. Instead of really like trying to go through all this difficulty of doing all this different stuff and trying to prove what he did or didn't do, they're just going to try to get him to admit it. All right. So they start interrogating Ernesto Miranda. All right. And for hours, they keep him in this room, and they'll turn on any lights, or I don't know if they turn on any lights or not. But for hours, they're interrogating. They're not like beating him in a corner or anything like that. But it's, the heights of make him sit there, make him think about it. Ernesto Miranda, he doesn't know what the rules are, right, in American society. He has the right to remain silent. He also has a right to a lawyer at any point. He can say, hey, I need a lawyer to come in and talk to me. He doesn't know any of this. He doesn't really know how the law works. So he is never told any of this by the police who says you need to confess. He's like, I'm not going to confess. And the police tell him, tell you what, if you confess, we'll let you leave. He's like, what? They're like, yeah, if you just say you did it, we're going to let you leave. And he's like, all right, I did it. And they're like, we're going to need you to, we're going to write that down. We're going to need you to sign this and verify this and stamp it. And he's like, and I can leave? They're like, sure. And so he signs this confession. And they're like, gotcha, all right? And they throw him in jail until his court date. They obviously weren't going to let him go, but they got his confession, all right? The two things that Ernesto did not know that he has a right to. He did not know that you have the right to remain silent. He didn't have to say anything. He also did not realize that he had the right to counsel. The right to counsel is a lawyer. He doesn't know he has this. So when he gets to court, all right, he actually brings this up. All right, he gets a lawyer appointed at that time, thanks to Gideon V. Wainwright. And his lawyer's like, wait a minute, this confession isn't going to stand up in court. He was coerced into giving this confession. He didn't know he didn't have to do it. And the judge throws it out. He's like, whatever. Like, who cares? Like, this dude's clearly a bad guy. Like, we're not going to worry about a technicality, whatever. And they go through and they convict him. And he's going to serve like 3 30-year consecutive sentences. So like 90 years in prison for all these crimes that he committed. So they throw him in prison. He immediately appeals and says, wait a minute. I didn't know I didn't have to confess to it because nobody told me I didn't have to. So he goes all the way to the Supreme Court, all right? And the Supreme Court looks at this, and this one's close. This is 5-4. And the Supreme Court sides with Miranda here, all right? That they say, no, you can't just convince somebody to confess and then like put them in jail because you coerced a coerced confession. They have to know their rights. The 4 dissenting decisions that are against that, like, wait a minute, if you let people know their rights, it's going to be so hard to get people to just confess if they know their rights. Think about that. They don't want people to know things because it'll be harder to put them in jail if they know things. All right? Now, imagine that Miranda was innocent and this happened to him. That would seem crazy. He's clearly not. He's not innocent. You do not have to like this guy at all. All right? But because his rights are violated, all right, even though there's a lot of anger against this decision because it looks like it's going to be really, really hard to get people to confess, because now, here's what has to happen. Now when somebody gets arrested, you literally have to like tell them their rights. Like every time, and they're, it's going to be so hard to get people to confess. Like that was a big pushback, which seems kind of crazy. Like, why would you want people to confess if there's a chance they didn't do it if they don't know their rights? So Miranda, convictions overturned. You're like, they did not let this guy go free. We're going to talk about it here in a second about what happens to him. But so Miranda's case overturned, all right? And police at this point, like, it's such a huge deal that basically police across the country see this like, like, that's not good. So they literally have, it's like your rights read to you. You get arrested, you have your rights read to you. They're literally called the Miranda Warning or the Miranda Rights, named after that guy, Ernesto Miranda, which is, and this is literally what is said if you're arrested. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to talk to a lawyer for advice before we ask you questions. You have the right to have a lawyer with you during questioning. All this stuff did not happen, with Miranda. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you before any questions if you wish. If you decide to answer questions now without your lawyer present, you have the right to stop answering at any time. Do you understand the rights that I have just read you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to me? Now, this has, because the police, they have to make sure this is done right. Because again, our entire concept in our justice system is we would rather occasionally let a guilty guy or girl go free, than accidentally imprison an innocent person. So there's a lot of people that were against this, because when you read this, how many guilty people were like, did it? Which it wasn't that big of a change, honestly. But there's a huge pushback against it. It really seems like the police are required to tell people they arrest, do not talk to me. But this way, you're guaranteed as an accused person to have your rights read to you. Now, you are probably wondering, What happened to Mr. Ernesto Miranda? It doesn't turn out well for him. So he is actually, so they throw that trial out, they try him again, they actually bring in evidence because they actually have to try this time. They convict him again. They're going to put him in jail for 30 years. So he goes to jail in 1967. This seems odd to me. For 30 years. He gets out in 1972. I don't know. Like, this is a violent crime. Whatever. He gets out in 1972. He actually becomes relatively famous for a couple years. He was for signing police's Miranda rights card, like, this is named after me, because the Supreme Court case happened very fast. And then a couple years later, he gets stabbed to death in a bar fight. So, like, I think 1976, he is stabbed to death in a bar fight. So, there's that. All right. So the question here is, what was the concern against Mirandizing people when they were arrested? Why were some people against this? And Mirandizing, that's what it's called. When you have your rights read to you, you've been Mirandized, all right? Named after Ernesto, a Miranda is Mirandizing somebody, is reading them their rights. Why were people against this? Like, 4 justices, it was 5-4, a lot were against it. And how does Mirandizing people, when arrested, help our society stay true to our original views of criminality as it pertains to the Constitution? Again, basically, how does reading people their rights help us stick with our core belief that you're innocent until proven guilty, and we would rather every now and then let a guilty person go than accidentally put a innocent person in jail? So, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. So if you're in North Carolina, this one took place in the backyard, depending where you are. This is in Charlotte, North Carolina, 1969. All right. So Brown versus Board of Education had ended legal school segregation. They said, no more do black kids have to go to an all-black school and white kids have to go to an all-white school. You go to whatever school you're closest to. And you would think, unless you live through it, then all of a sudden schools are, 50-50, black and white. That does not happen, at all. The decision really doesn't change very many areas. Charlotte being an example, that big old city, all right? So Charlotte, while in the South, in North Carolina, while in the South, we were a much more, because I'm in North Carolina, much more moderate state. So these type of things probably would not have happened at the time in Alabama or Mississippi that were aggressively against school integration. But in North Carolina, here's what happens. It becomes obvious that the black schools that have been around for a long time are built in the middle of the black neighborhoods. The white schools, which had been around for a long time, were built in the middle of white neighborhoods back when segregation was a thing. You lift segregation, the white kids still live near the white school and the black kids still live near the black school. Very little changes in the demographics in the school. Black kids still go to school with black kids and white kids still go to school with white kids. I think I said that right. I said that really fast. Hope that came out right. Anywho, so Charlotte decides to be aggressive on this, all right? And they start busing, all right? Which means, the city center of Charlotte, the middle of Charlotte, was densely populated with African Americans. The outside areas was mainly white. They're going to start bringing black students from the inner part of Charlotte and moving them to predominantly white schools, forcing integration. So you're literally taking people out of their school district to go to another school so that there's more racial harmony on this. This goes to the Supreme Court. The crazy part about this is Charlotte does them themselves. Knowing there's going to be pushback, the NAACP themselves actually sues against it. So the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, like the law, but they push it, right? Basically, they act like they're against it to basically push it through the courts so it gets to the Supreme Court so the Supreme Court can make a final ruling on it with the hopes that it gets permanently locked in at a federal level, and that's exactly what happens. It's a pretty brazen move, but after the Supreme Court hears this, and it's Swan versus the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, is the idea that all kids need equal opportunity. Having the black schools and white schools, by this point, we're 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education, people realize having segregated schools is not good in our society. We're seeing, the racial tensions in society, if the kids grow up with other races, it should drastically help the racial issues in the United States. So the Supreme Court agrees that this, for the betterment of society, is completely legal and acceptable, and Charlotte basically forcefully busing people outside of their school district. So it doesn't mean a lot of kids have long rides. Anybody that went to school at the time could, might be traveling completely across the city, and over an hour away to get to their designed school. What's interesting here about this court case, and how it is different than Brown versus Board of Education, is they basically built in a kill switch in it, which it really shows a lot of forethought on the judges here. So when Brown versus Board of Education was passed, it was, from now on, never again are we going to have segregation in schools. Like, that's not, that is completely, let's throw that out, and it's like a permanent thing. Swan versus Mecklenburg is like, yeah, we need to do this. But over time, when, we've lifted all these rules against, what neighborhoods white people and black people can live in, you'll be a more diverse society. We're not always going to need to ship people from this school to this school. So once Charlotte feels like they have met this integration goal, they can stop doing this, which is unique for a Supreme Court decision, being like, when y'all feel ready to not do this anymore, you can. And a lot of it has to do with Charlotte had decided on their own they wanted to do this to start with. So for the 1970s and 1980s, this is how Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools went. In the 90s, there's a large influx of people into Charlotte from different ethnic backgrounds from up north, because Charlotte was growing huge. It's enough that they got an NFL team. The Carolina Panthers get developed in Charlotte. Charlotte grows really fast. There's still poverty. There's still white kids and black kids, but you have a lot of other minority groups with Hispanic populations, and these other parts are going into Charlotte, and they are going to phase out. Charlotte is going to phase out this busing. Now, you still have poor areas with a poor school and rich areas with a rich school. To prevent that from happening the way it has worked up to present day, and this is 2021, in Charlotte, in that school district, Mecklenburg School District, you basically live in a vector. There's probably a more proper term for it, with like 25 schools in it. All right, you can. I'm way oversimplifying this. You can choose which school you want to go to within this like vector, and so Charlotte is broken up into different vectors based that has all different types of people and all the different vectors. I'm using the word vector, and you can choose which school you want to go to. It's really complex. You have to like your first, second, third choice, and then you have your home school. It gets complicated, but this is how Charlotte moves on from this forced busing to integrate their schools in order to have a better society. And the Supreme Court is going to uphold that. But how are the outcomes of Brown versus Board of Education and this court case different? One of the biggest things is that this court case agrees with this forcing kids to go further away from school, whereas Brown versus Board of Education, you went to your closest school. But not only that, this one basically said this court case is enforced until you decide you don't want to anymore. It's very Brown versus Board of Education. There is no question. This one basically gave you an out that it wasn't going to last forever, and that's pretty unique when it comes to Supreme Court cases. But it has to do with busing in Charlotte. All right, that is as far as we're going to get today. Hope you enjoyed that. I answered this completely, and I will see you guys tomorrow.